Vice President of Economic Competitiveness for the Greenville Chamber. We host these community matter discussions every week to connect you with local, state, and national leaders. You can find past recordings as well as the upcoming Community Matters schedule on our website, www.greenvillechamber.org. Before we begin today, a few housekeeping notes. First, all attendees should be on mute when you come in. Please submit questions through this chat feature. We'll wait to take questions till the end, but as they arise, please feel to submit them in the chat feature. So before we get started today, I would like to recognize a very special sponsor, Spectrum Reach. Thank you for your generous sponsorship of this program. I'd like to invite Daryl Heller, Sales Manager at Spectrum Reach, to say a few words and to introduce our featured speaker. Daryl.
Thank you, Hank. Spectrum Reach provides TV and digital advertising and marketing solutions that can help to grow a business by reaching the right customers. We use data like our set-top box viewership for creative campaigns, which are driven by insightful research to understand consumer behavior. This helps us develop effective messaging for any form of marketing video. Spectrum Reach was just awarded America's Most Trusted Media Partner by the Myers Report 2020. As our communities begin to reopen, Spectrum Reach is fully invested with helping businesses rebuild. We've launched a local partnership program I'd be happy to discuss if you reach out to me. I'd now like to introduce today's featured speaker, Jeff Korzenik. Jeff is Chief Investment Strategist for Fifth Third Bank. He's a regular guest on CNBC, Bloomberg, and Fox Business. And the fun fact is Spectrum Reach can help you place your business message on CNBC and Fox Business. But Jeff's his writings on economics and public policy have appeared in numerous national and regional publications. He was recently elected a member of the Council on Criminal Justice for his work on intersection of the justice system and labor markets. Jeff's forthcoming book, Untapped Talent, How Second Chance Hiring Works for Your Business and the Community, shares the business case and best practices for hiring people with criminal records, and will be published by HarperCollins Leadership in early 2021. Jeff is a graduate of Princeton University and is a passionate supporter of cultural organizations, serving as trustee of the Harris Theater for Music and Dance in Chicago, as well as a member of the Board of Advisors of the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem, Massachusetts. I'll now turn it back over to Hank to start the discussion.
Thanks, Daryl. And again, appreciate your sponsorship and what Spectrum Reach does in the community. Thank you. Yeah. Jeff, welcome back to Greenville.
Thank you so much.
We're very glad to have you here. How are things in the Windy City?
We're doing okay. I mentioned if I seem distracted, it's because there's drilling going on in the condo above me and lawn clearing and just outside my window, but I'm glad to be on the call.
Thank you very much. So we live in interesting times, as I say. Appreciate your perspective on this. Can you give us some perspective on the current economic situation? Where are we now in the business cycle?
Yeah, let me pull up a screen with some information, and that we'll be using through this presentation. And take me just a moment to get that set up.
Surely.
And you'll see, as some of you may have seen, a publication we put out at the beginning of this, the pandemic and the shutdown, called Nasty, Brutish, and Hopefully Short. And I think that does tell the tale to some degree. It is certainly nasty and brutish. This is a chart you see before you of the unemployment rate in the United States. This goes back to the Great Depression. And you'll see that you really have to go back to that Great Depression to see any comparable level of unemployment. And in fact, we believe that the unemployment report actually understated it. The unemployment report is done as a household survey, and the Bureau of Labor Statistics believes that many people who had been furloughed and expected to go back to work, when asked if they were unemployed, said no, put us in an other category. And so it probably dramatically understated the unemployment rate. So as bad as the 14% levels we're dealing with by public government releases are, it actually got much worse. Now, the unemployment report is showing correctly that we are improving and that we are off the bottom, We believe the economy started to grow most likely sometime in early May. So technically, you may have seen the headlines that we went into a recession in February. That's the declaration of the National Bureau of Economic Research. They are the arbiters of when recession starts. This will probably be the shortest recession on record, and that's very important. If you look back to the Great Depression, you'll see that unemployment rates stayed elevated for 10 years. You had double-digit rates of unemployment for 10 years. And part of how we should understand any economic cycle is not just how bad it gets, but how long it lasts. And it certainly lasted very long in the Great Depression. We also had that experience in 2008, 2009. Thought it was be interesting to take a look at just the market, to the degree the market reflects economic activity. What we did is we looked at the market peak preceding the 2008-09 Great Recession. And then we looked at the market peak from February, and we indexed those to adjust for different levels. And what you can see is that the markets are at least anticipating that this will not be a long drawn out recession. So the blue line is the S&P 500 performance from the peak in the Great Recession. The green line is, I don't know what we'll end up calling it, the Great Disruption is our vote at Fifth Third. The green line is how we've responded. We're almost back up to the old highs. And that's reflecting a belief, largely, but not totally correct in our view, that we're going to snap back fairly quickly. Oh, Hank, you're on mute.
Thank you. Haven't done these before. With unemployment so high, how does this really impact the American consumer, the broad economy?
Sure. I mean, we're a consumer-oriented economy, so high unemployment rates absolutely matter. And again, it's difficult because we do believe that the official government data unemployment rate is distorted by people who've essentially answered the survey question incorrectly. But even before we got official government unemployment reports, we started getting some very interesting private sector surveys. This was done by a news organization, and it surveyed where people were. The survey dates for this were the very end of March. And you could see, and they broke it down by what income quintile you were in and what was the impact that you were having or impact that the pandemic and the lockdowns were having on your employment. And you can see that it varied, the impact varied quite a bit depending on your economic status, your income status. And that the bulk of the pain was felt by the lower middle and middle income earners. And a significant amount of pain then by the lowest quintile earners. So this is important in judging the impact on the economy because not every quintile has an equal impact on US economic activity. In fact, if you look at where the money is, the bulk of income is in the top quintile, and therefore the bulk of spending is also in the top quintile. And you go down to fourth quintile, so just below the top quintile of earners, they're responsible for nearly a quarter of spending. Top quintile is responsible for about half of spending. These are the quintiles that were least impacted by the pandemic. Now, we of course couldn't go out and spend money when most retail stores and restaurants and movie theaters, all sorts of entertainment and travel venues were closed. But that money didn't go away. It went into a much higher savings rate. We actually saw a 33% savings rate. That's a record for the US economy. That tells us that despite the high level of unemployment, there's a lot of consumer firepower left. And we are likely, as things open up, to see a pretty dramatic pop in some of this. But there will be impairment because there is still going to be a significantly high rate of unemployment. And the longer that lingers, the longer that's an impairment for the U.S. economy.
Very good. What do you think about the government's reaction to the crisis so far? How are we doing?
You know, maybe this is my cynicism, but I think we did actually surprisingly well, given that this was legislation crafted on the fly in many ways. If you look at just the size of the stimulus packages to date for this episode, it's really striking how large the support has been relative to the size of GDP, and also relative to past deep economic downturns. So if you look towards the left-hand side, you'll see all of the fiscal stimulus measures of the New Deal over roughly a 10-year period added up to 5.7% of GDP. In 08-09, it took us a while to formulate a response. So in 08, we had a 1% stimulus. And then in 09, we had further stimulus measures that added up to 5.5% of GDP. So total Great Recession, 08-09, we had a stimulus of 6.5% of GDP. We've already stimulated the economy with by the amount of 13.5% of GDP. That's really a stunning number. It also, incidentally, while stimulus measures are going on around the globe, the U.S. has actually done one of the largest relative to GDP. I think that's probably a pretty good policy. We had, to the degree that there was any silver lining to 08-09, it helped us better prepare in terms of having a set of tools at the ready. We had to invent a lot of things in 08-09 to respond to the banking system crisis in particular, as well as just the deep recession. We were able to put those into play immediately. And it's important because if you look at how a typical downturn plays out, there's a cycle, and it tends to be a little bit of a vicious cycle for a while. The immediate response is a problem with liquidity. Then you can have a problem with solvency, and then that insolvency tends to lead to further layoffs, or attempts to put off insolvency leads to layoffs, which hurt consumption in the economy. And if you look at the types of measures that the federal government undertook in response, it really can be seen that it lines up with these concerns. The Federal Reserve came in right away with quantitative easing and expanded the package of things that they are willing to invest in order to provide liquidity to the markets. That's been very, very important. Then we had the Fed also lowering interest rates. That puts less strain on lenders, and even high yield interest rates, which have come down, which spike, of course, in a recession, but have come down very quickly, didn't even spike that far. Given the depth of the downturn. Some of that is because the Fed lowered interest rates and was out there buying high yield bonds. So it's a combination of factors from the Fed that we think were very helpful in lessening at least so far, lessening the impact of this downturn. But that still leaves the consumer very exposed, particularly with these high levels of unemployment. And that's where the Paycheck Protection Program really helped quite a bit. It helped preserve paychecks, keep people on the payroll. Not every firm was eligible for this, so you did see layoffs, of course, in larger companies. But to address those needs, the government expanded unemployment benefits and made some, frankly, I think very good choices, like allowing employers to cut back hours of employees and still make them eligible for pro rata shares of unemployment insurance. I think that was pretty good policy, and these policies have had a place in time. The Fed has obviously signaled just this week that they see keeping interest rates low and seeing their asset purchase program continuing for some time. I think that kind of forward guidance is reassuring to the market. But we are going to have some challenges with expirations to the payroll protection program, the risk that small businesses will just all at once respond by laying off these employees instead of keeping them on the government subsidized payroll. We have risks, other risks associated. It's likely that these will be dealt with in the next round of stimulus that will probably pass probably sometime after July 4th. But these are policies that have been in place, have worked. Many of them should not be extended forever, and we'll talk a little bit about that. We talk a little bit about that later, but it will be important to ease the transition off of these policies very gradually and very thoughtfully.
So a lot of things happening, a lot of unprecedented activity. What does all this activity mean for the speed and the shape of the recovery? Was it going to be a V, a W, a U? What do you think?
Yeah, and the latest trend on Wall Street has been to call it a Nike swoosh shaped recovery, where you have this sort of rounded bottom and a slow response. We've generally been in the V camp. That's the typical, this is data on S&P 500, which is of course not an exact proxy of economic activity, but it gives you a sense of what happens in past cycles. And we also push back a little bit on the thought that this is unprecedented. We've looked through quite a number of cycles. We actually, most people only look back to 1927. That's the start of S&P 500 data. We actually asked one of our data providers to supplement that with Dow Jones data, because that took us back into the 1800s. And we thought that was important, for one, because it captured the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918-19. And so we have seen some similarities. It helped us judge the impact, the potential impact on investors and the economy, when we could look back at such a breadth of impacts and sources of impact. V bottoms are frankly a little bit of a misnomer. There's not exactly a super sharp rebound. Usually there's a little bit of churn and rounding out. And what I would say is, while it is true that the shorter the downturn tends to lead to a quicker upturn, it's not one for one. Short declines, quick declines rather, tend to reflect one-time events and not underlying structural imbalances in the economy. And so those are easier to recover from. And in many ways, the pandemic is just a one-shot kind of deal. We came into this with some economic strength. As we all know, the economy was doing well. We didn't have major overhangs in housing like we did in 08-09. We didn't have excesses of speculation like we saw in also in 07 in real estate, but also say the dot-com boom and bust. All those kind of things were imbalances. We just don't have them now. We have our own challenges, but not imbalances. And so the kind of long, slow decay that took us from 07 into 08 and took years to come out of is not what we expect here, at least not in terms of GDP. This was a fast downturn. All the employment data suggests that we will have a pretty good upturn. However, we think that there's a risk that it stalls out a little bit. And this doesn't have to be reflected in corporate earnings. It's interesting looking back at 08-09, corporations got back to the same bottom line. So the S&P 500 returned to peak earnings, even when revenues were still 10% below the peak. So we can have a good experience as investors, but as business people, I think we have a challenge. And this challenge is evident in what happened in 08-09. This is a chart of long-term unemployment. If you look at what percentage of those who are unemployed have been unemployed for a long time. Long-term unemployment is defined by economists as 27 weeks, so basically half of the year. And our fear is that we run into a similar problem we ran into in 08-09. You had a big dislocation in the economy, people were unemployed, and then you had government subsidies of unemployment benefits. In the case of 08-09, they extended unemployment benefits, which typically expire, 6 months sort of thing. 26 weeks is typical. Some states are 13 weeks, but they were extended by federal mandate to 99 weeks. And while in the beginning there really were no jobs out there, it also allowed people who are collecting unemployment benefits and able to live off of that depressed level of income it allowed them to put off making some hard decisions. Do you take the job at lower pay? Do you relocate for a job? Do you sell the house? And while I don't mean to understate the pain of those decisions, the reality is, for those reasons, as well as dislocations in the economy, we had an unprecedented level of long-term unemployment. People simply didn't get back into the workforce fast enough. And when that happens, you have a very clear relationship between the longer your time of unemployment, the harder it is to get back into the labor market. And the longer you're unemployed and can't get back into the labor market, the more likely you are to simply drop out of the labor market. And our belief at Fifth Third is that we lost at least 1 million workers, dropped out of the labor force because of their long-term unemployment status. But it's really quite stunning. By 2010, as you can see on this chart, nearly half the workforce were well over 40% of the unemployed had been unemployed for 6 months or more. And if you think that our unemployment really started in March, it is going to be a real challenge if we don't have all of those people, or as many of those people as possible, back to work by the end of the year. If they enter 2021 with 6 months or more of unemployment, there's a real risk that many of them will never come back. And that's going to be a drag on economic growth for sure, both through the loss of participation in the labor force, which is a big driver of growth, as well as, of course, with diminished consumer demand because of that. We do know that Congress is thinking about this as they look to adjust unemployment benefits. In the next package, which again we expect to come out in July, there's some talk of addressing this, by tying the extension of unemployment benefits or bonus unemployment benefits to the level of unemployment. So if there truly are no jobs around, very high unemployment, they will provide more of a cushion. Perhaps they shouldn't, but this is an election year. I think they almost certainly will provide some kind of a cushion. The other idea being kicked around is bonuses for people who go back to work, and just again offering a little bit of a carrot to get people back in the workforce. I don't know what the right mix is, but I think it is a positive that this problem appears to be understood by Congress, and hopefully we'll see it in the package, something that addresses this concern. It's a very real concern. I started talking about this back in April and March on the TV networks, and the response was always, oh, we're so far away from that. But here we are in mid-June, and we're halfway through that period that it takes to get to long-term unemployment. So I have some very real concerns about this. Again, I think this would be easier to get a better solution if it weren't an election year, but it is an election year. At least this concern is on the table. We'll see what Congress comes up with.
Very good. I know labor force participation and getting folks into the workforce is very important, has been important to Greenville for quite a while. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. I think the other risk is if we do get a second wave of coronavirus, is could we have instead of a V, could we have a W kind of recovery? What's your thought on that?
Perfect question, and that is very much on investors' minds. I mean, that was largely responsible, I think, for the downturn yesterday. One was a little bit of a pickup in identified cases, and in some states, some pickup in hospitalizations, which is really the greater concern from the risk of a second wave, or of a serious second wave. And then, of course, the other factor was, the Fed talking about elevated unemployment for longer, which we think is actually correct. Let's see if there we go. Sorry, I had slides out of order. Forgive me. One of the things that's animated this discussion of second wave is that people looked back at the Spanish flu pandemic. And we were very early on at Fifth Third in talking about the Spanish flu pandemic as a precedent. We were frankly got there because during the pickup of Ebola infections about 5 years ago, we started reading up about it. So it was something we were already familiar with. But you can't read this analogy too far. I mean, people are saying we are at risk of this horrible, deadly second wave because that's what happened in the Spanish flu pandemic. And that is what happened. The Spanish flu pandemic started in roughly the spring of 1918. The fall, it came back. I mean, that sounds familiar, of course, or sounds like it resonates. And that fall second infection wave was actually the deadliest of all. And then there was another wave in 1919. But you really have to keep in mind that we've had 100 years of medical advances. You know, we are searching at least for antiviral drugs. We have nothing that's been particularly effective yet in treatment, but there are antiviral drugs that may help. Critical, though, are antibacterial drugs, because one of the reasons that the second wave of the Spanish flu pandemic was so deadly was not the virus itself, but follow-on bacterial infections. And those are certainly much more treatable today. They didn't have antibiotics in 1918, 1919. We're seeing some really interesting, promising results from plasma treatments, taking antibodies for people who have recovered from COVID-19. Those seem to work. We seem to have better treatment protocols. We are doing better at this. And also we should think about not just medical advances, but technological advances, contact tracing. You know, how do you do contact tracing in 1918 when hardly anyone has a telephone? For instance, and now, you know, we can track people through the location of their cell phones, see where they've been. So these are all things that lead us to believe it's not going to be, we have a much better arsenal to defend ourselves than we had in 1918. But we also have to take into account what a different world we were living in at the time the Spanish flu's second wave hit. World War I was still going on. And I think it's probably pretty big challenge to practice social distancing and good hygiene in a trench. And then after the war ended on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of the armistice in 1918, you had this pandemic going on, and you had massive troop movements around the world, crowded troop ships and things like that, that also led to a spread. And then people have often mentioned that, well, you know, the 1918 America was much more rural, and so we're at greater risk today with our urban, being a more urbanized society. That's true and it's not true. It is true in aggregate. Yes, we were more rural then, but when you look at the conditions of our major cities in 1918, 1919, they were more densely populated than today. So for instance, Manhattan, the population of Manhattan in the 1920 census was 1 million more people than the population of Manhattan today. And you have cities like Detroit, even Chicago had a greater population then. Where people live tend to be in much more tenements and things that were much more conducive to spreading. And then the other thing that was conducive to spreading was public transit. We weren't a car culture then. One of the things as we investigated this that I thought was really astounding was that public transit ridership in the United States, in absolute terms, let alone relative terms, which was even greater, public transit ridership in the United States peaked in 1926. So not only were you sending people back to these very dense cities, you were crowding them together on public transit, which we know from New York City's experience and Chicago's experience is really an environment that tends to spread this disease. So will we get a pickup as we reopen in infections? I think that's likely. Is there some seasonality to this that suggests that the fall will be a little bit of an acceleration? I think that's also likely, but nothing that is going to require the kind of massive shutdown of the economy again. We're simply going to adapt to this in many ways that we've been doing, you know, even without government mandate.
Well, just as the Spanish flu was a global issue, obviously, with severe impacts, this pandemic is a global issue, and lots of countries are dealing with it in lots of different ways. And it's been rather interesting to see the responses. So what can we learn from other countries?
We like to point to some of the Asian countries that have done a good job. This is the number of active cases in South Korea. And you can see they felt the infection wave very acutely in March, but they've done a very good job in controlling it. What's interesting to us is the South Korean response is really probably as good as it gets. I mean, good experience in Taiwan as well, Japan. The reason we think, and South Korea is very important, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan are very important analogies for us to look at, or examples for us to look at, because these are democracies. People do move about largely freely. This is not authoritarian China or semi-authoritarian Singapore. And yet it worked. Now, one of the reasons it worked is South Korea's pandemic, the coronavirus pandemic, was essentially the third pandemic they've lived through in the last 25 years. So they're used to it. They have a public health authorities who are kind of trained in dealing with this, and a public that is more accepting of some of these guidelines, and also tended to self-impose social distancing, and mask wearing is much more commonplace in Asia, as you all know. So I think that is an important precedent for us. It shows that it could be done. What is also interesting to us is the debate that is going on today. And while we've all become armchair epidemiologists, well, I think the jury is still out on how dangerous the risk of infection from people who are not showing symptoms, asymptomatic spread is. The World Health Organization, which has really struggled to provide clear messaging. I understand that things change as you learn more about a disease, and messages can change, but clarity of message, when you have a message, make sure people understand what it is. And there is a garbled message out there right now about asymptomatic spread. About whether people who don't show symptoms can actually spread the disease. The World Health Organization referenced initially that it is very rare, and then they kind of walked that back. I think it's probably right that it's rare, because if you look at the measures that places like South Korea have taken that have been very effective, they're essentially the kind of measures you would take if you didn't have asymptomatic spread. Contact tracing, right? What's the point of contact tracing if people without symptoms can spread it? Taking temperatures before allowing people to work. All of those are things that are, if they work, would be consistent with asymptomatic spread not being a big issue. So I think that when we look at what's been working in South Korea and also places like New Zealand, maybe that suggests that the World Health Organization's announcement of asymptomatic spread being very limited, maybe there is indeed some truth to it. We don't know. Either way, what happened in South Korea is very encouraging. And I think it also is something that we will be putting more focus on, looking at where it's worked well. Germany is about the only place in Western Europe that's really worked well. South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and then places like New Zealand. And they also all pursued this as if it were something where contact tracing and only symptomatic spread was the problem.
Interesting. Well, so looking forward, there's some encouraging signs, but what do you think it's going to look like? What sectors of the economy will do well? What do you think is going to lag in the next little bit?
I love to point to South Korea about this, right? Here they've gone with 3 pandemics in 25 years, and yet people still go out to restaurants, they still fly on airplanes, they still go out in public. So all those early, prognostications of people will never fly again, everything's going to be, different this time. I've always viewed with skepticism, and I think South Korea really kind of gives us an indication that some of the changes that were predicted are too dramatic. It's interesting. I'm going to point quickly. I don't have a slide for this. I wish I did, but just came from one of our research providers. Airline travel volume has already recovered half of what it lost. And if the trend of recovery in airline passenger volume were to continue, so the trend from the bottom to where we are now, if that were to continue, we'd be up to the old volume levels as early as August. Now, our research providers and others don't believe that that's the case, but it should tell you, and I flew last week, I was frankly shocked how crowded my planes were. And not every airport is crowded, but I can tell you, going through Charlotte, at least the main terminals were surprisingly crowded. So all this is to say that we should take with a grain of salt this talk of everything is going to be different afterwards. That wasn't the case in South Korea, and I don't think it's going to be the case here. But some things are going to change. And we view the pandemic as essentially an accelerator of trends that were already in place. And let me start right out with reshoring of manufacturing, because that is so important to Greenville, to Spartanburg, to the Carolinas in general. We had already been seeing the trend in this country towards manufacturing jobs coming back. That trend really started in 2012. And then with the trade restrictions in the trade tensions in 2018, you got a little bit of a new jolt of interest in trying to at least diversify the global supply chain further away from China. And some of that, of course, would mean the US would be a beneficiary. We think this got supercharged. There is bipartisan interest in being less reliant on other countries in critical industries. We already do this in defense. I think we're going to start doing this in healthcare goods, healthcare devices, and even the most basic things like masks and gloves, things that have been offshore for a long period of time. I think there's going to be an interest in bringing those back. I will say that I think we are going to run into the problem that U.S. manufacturers were facing amazingly just 6 months ago, and that is a labor constraint. What has held back U.S. manufacturing to a significant degree is, the dollar got stronger and that hurt, but a lot of it was our lack of availability of labor. I will say that Greenville, Spartanburg, and in general the Southeast, as well as parts of the Midwest, have a much better culture of manufacturing than other parts of the country. There is still a belief in manufacturing. It is still there's not as much of a prejudice against goods producing jobs as a career. I often use the example of Chicago, where until recently there were 25,000 or so unfilled manufacturing job openings. And yet the Chicago public school system, the second largest school system in the public school system in the United States, within the last 6 months, shut down their advanced manufacturing training programs in high school because everyone's supposed to go to college, and that kind of view. Very short-sighted in my view, and I argue against it publicly. We have in our here in Chicago in our community college system, which for decent students is actually free, so it's a great opportunity. We have a wonderful advanced manufacturing training program. They can't attract students. The guidance counselors in the Chicago public schools are incented to send kids financially, and in terms of sort of career advancement, are incented to send people to four-year colleges. So instead of filling these great manufacturing jobs, giving people great opportunities to earn what in some cases become six-figure jobs when you include benefits, they're sending kids to places like Chicago State University, which is a typical place for under-resourced students to go, and it has a 11% 6-year graduation rate. So kids, instead of being given encouraged to go down these great paths, go to these schools. It's not a good fit for them. They've taken out debt to go there. They end up no degree, no career track, and a pile of debt. So we really have to rethink a lot of, as a society, as an economy, if we're going to take advantage of this opportunity. So we think that's going to, that will continue. I think that's very beneficial for your region. In general, we see industries continuing to be disrupted that were already being disrupted. Again, it's not that the pandemic is changing the world, it's accelerating the world that already existed. The easy ones here are online retail, which was already growing its market share versus going to a store. That's probably accelerated. There's good and bad in that. You know, the good is that there's all sorts of new jobs in logistics and distribution and transportation that get created by some of these. The bad is that this means that, say, a lot of workers who were furloughed from department stores will have their jobs permanently disrupted. And while there may be, we don't know if it's going to be 1 for 1 or a better number or a worse number, but there will be new job openings. There are people hiring today. The problem is, will they be a match for the skills of the people who've been laid off and displaced? Will they be a match for the geography? So those disruptions we think will continue. They're important. They're interesting. Some of them are I think, just unadulterated benefits. So telemedicine, for instance, which is much more efficient for doctors and for patients. All of those trends will continue, but there's costs to those disruptions as well. I think you also have to look at second order effects. So again, one of the trends that was already in place that got supercharged is work from home. So work from home now means you need different kinds of real estate. Everyone's talked about what this might mean to the downside for commercial real estate, but it's also got implications for residential real estate. We know from that chart I showed you early on, which broke up down unemployment and work from home by income quintile. A lot of the people who worked from home, as in response to the pandemic, were among the top earners. What kind of house will they want? Will we go back to the McMansions, and because people will want a home office? My wife and I are actually looking ourselves, and space for a home office has gone up enormously on our list of important features. Another impact on real estate, again, a trend that's already in existence. Millennials were moving out of the urban core and into suburban houses. Now, they do tend to like a little bit different type of environment. They are much more predisposed towards walkable communities and smaller sort of village settings than large suburban tract houses. But that trend is in place. And frankly, the reliance on public transit that millennials have relied upon in the urban core is a lot less attractive and also a lot less profitable for cities. Now, Chicago, again, where I live, has one of the largest public transit systems in the country, and no one's on it. That is we were already losing people to millennials riding bicycles, and now this. These are real challenges for cities as well. One of the second order effects we imagine is going to be a lot of strain on cities and states. Some of that we think will be addressed in the next round of stimulus, but that also will address shortfalls in operating budgets. They won't address the continued underfunding of pensions in about four states are really known for this. Living in Chicago, Chicago and the state of Illinois are the poster children for bad governance in the United States, bad fiscal governance. The city of Chicago floated a municipal bond issuance, short-term issuance, and had to pay about a 5% interest rate to investors. That's unheard of, but a reflection of some of the stresses and strains. We look at New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, Illinois, to some degree, Kentucky, as states with real issues here of underfunding of pensions. New York's okay on that front, but underfunding of pensions is a big issue for Connecticut, New Jersey, Illinois, and Kentucky. And we have already seen people leaving those states. Some of that we think will accelerate down to the southeast. Again, when I'm speaking in my home base, I'm a bearer of bad tidings. But let's face it, for South Carolina, this is probably pretty glad tidings in terms of continuing to fill your labor needs. The last thing, and where I'll end this on my slideshow, is the employer-employee relationship. We already had seen a long-term trend with the millennials in that millennials, as well as a broader cross-section of the workforce, demanded more of their employers and demanded things that were other than pay: flexibility to work from home, flexibility with job schedule, benefits, family leave benefits, even before laws required it. All of those things pointed to a different kind of employer-employee relationship, one where the employer is much more wholly invested in the general welfare of their employees. And what is particularly interesting to me is we have models for this already in the economy, and they happen to be second chance employers. The employers that had already embraced hiring people with criminal records had learned that for it to be successful, they had to provide a lot of wraparound services to help people stay employed. And in many ways, it's actually a good business investment, which is encouraging. All of this, when you talk about additional flexibility, additional benefits, sounds to the ears of an employer just like an absolute lose for them in terms of higher compensation related costs. But the reality is that the employers who have practiced this have found that they get much higher levels of employee engagement and much lower levels of turnover. So we think that those models are going to be explored much more, and it will be one of the features of what changes. Thanks.
That's interesting. I know we share a common passion, I think, for fair chance hiring and getting those folks back into the workforce. And you've got a new book coming out, 2021, is that right? Or is it?
Yeah, we had actually delayed the publication. It was supposed to come out in February, and then when the unemployment rate went soaring, I said to my publisher, no one's going to care about this issue, and I think maybe I should have switched it back.
Well, in this labor market now, since unemployment has shot up so much, do you think there's a change in the attitude of employers to expand the workforce, labor force, through this mechanism, so to speak, or will it be strong as you had predicted before?
Yeah, I've had a real sea change on this. When unemployment shot up, I thought, well, no one will buy, maybe someone will buy the book in 2024 or something like that. But I've always argued, and you've heard me argue it at events for your chamber, that the demographic picture of the United States is such that even if we were to get a recession, even, which obviously we're getting out of right now, that we still are going to have a labor shortage quickly in the United States because we just didn't have enough births. And birth rates for the millennials peaked in 1990. Those folks are 30 years old now. They're pretty much all in the labor force. If we're hiring 25-year-olds, that birth rate was 20% below the millennial peak, and birth rates, today or last year were 40% below the millennial peak. So we are setting up for a long-term labor shortage in the United States. So there's always been that need. What has really changed is the success that second chance employers have had with their employees during this very strange time. I've spoken to a number of prominent second chance employers about whether the widespread availability of labor now changes their practices. And every single one of them has been adamant that they are not going to change their practices because their second chance hires are among their strongest employees. One person up in Akron, Ohio said, they're more of an investment up front, but they're worth it in the end. And I'll share, for those of you who are on LinkedIn, I'd urge you to go ahead and send me an invite if you're interested in these issues. I posted something late last night, It's someone I profile in my book. Jeff Brown, who's the owner of Brown Superstores, a grocery store, small grocery store chain in South New Jersey and in Philadelphia, and he's a really interesting guy. 600 of his 2,500 employees are second chance hires, people who have a criminal record. And he does it the right way, totally embraces them, gives them opportunities. He set up a nonprofit with his wife to help train people. He's encouraging others in Philadelphia. And, you know, this kind of innovation that you see is reflected. I find that second chance employers are innovators in other areas. What he's known for is he is the grocer to the urban food deserts. 6 of his stores are in places that people said you can't have a good modern grocery store. Basically, really, Philadelphia, for those of you who don't know, is the poorest of our 10 largest cities in the United States, and their poorest neighborhoods really are neighborhoods of desperation. Jeff, who's a 4th generation grocer, has found a way to make it profitable, and 2 of his stores were looted. He called the police repeatedly, never came. And they were looted. 2 of his stores were looted for 15 straight hours. That was last week. They're already open again. Community volunteers have come to help clean up there. He's had incredible community response. Because of this, his employees have been, you know, putting on YouTube how much, you know, being employed there, the opportunities it's been for them. So I spoke to Jeff around this time, and Jeff Brown, and we were talking about the employment practices, and he said, you know, my second chance employees have a lot of grit, and that's a very commonly used word among second chance employers. And Jeff mentioned that he had heard in Philadelphia a lot of businesses were having trouble getting their employees to come back during the pandemic. So even the essential businesses couldn't get their employees, and they had absenteeism rates of something like 30%. He had no problem. He said, my second chance employees are used to navigating risk every day. This is just another day at the office for them, and their level of dedication they get. If they're not there working, their neighborhood doesn't get fed. So I thought that was a great story, and I didn't talk about all of that on the LinkedIn post, but that's the kind of response we're getting. Every one of them said, we're going to continue with our second chance hiring. Now we're going to add to this the civil unrest and criminal justice issues today. I think that has brought a great urgency to this discussion. You know, it's one thing to denounce racism. I personally don't know anyone who's for racism. You know, this is, you know, most people in the country obviously want people to have opportunity. The problem becomes when you start looking at the impact of the criminal justice system on the African American community. 1 in 3 Black men have a felony conviction. And we know from all sorts of data, as well as just kind of common sense, that a felony conviction is a huge barrier to getting a job or to getting a good job, being employed to your potential and capability. So that tells me that if we are going to find a way towards greater equality of opportunity in the United States, we have to address second chance hiring. So I'm actually very encouraged that despite the high level of unemployment, we may see more of corporate America taking a serious look at how we bring this about. And the pathway is not just hiring, you know, someone with a potential skin color or someone with a criminal record. It is finding a way to support them in that employment and give them the opportunity to contribute to the economy to their potential. That's good for business. That means criminal justice reform is good for business, but the pathway in many ways to this is through second chance employment.
Thank you. That's encouraging. I think with the Chamber's vision of a globally competitive upstate economy where businesses succeed and people prosper, it hits home for us tremendously. So thank you.
I have to give a little shout out to the Greenville Chamber and the Upstate Coalition, because you were one of the leaders around the country. There are a handful of chambers that have really already been encouraging this, and I think that kind of expertise, you've laid the groundwork to make this happen by introducing this thought, and so I think that's very much to the Chamber's credit.
Well, thank you. There's a lot more work to be done. So now really it's time for attendee questions, and I'm looking at the chat box and I don't see any offhand. So nothing at this point. So I think what we'll do is I'd like to first, again, thank you all very much for Jeff for doing this today, and I want to turn it back to Daryl and Spectrum Reach for some final comments from their perspective.
I just want to say thank you, Hank and Jeff. That was a great talk, great information. And I do want everyone to remember as we open back up that Spectrum Reach is really committed to helping local businesses any way we can. And we have launched our local partnership program that we would be happy to discuss with you.
Very good. So I'd like to thank everybody for attending today. Jeff, very much. Daryl, Spectrum, thank you very much. And all of our attendees. This recording will be shared on the Greenville Chamber's website and will be sent to all the attendees with a survey. Please take that survey for us. And don't forget that this is part of an ongoing series. On Tuesday, we'll be joined by Derek Lewis, who's the Executive Director for Greenville First Steps and a trustee on the Greenville County School Board, as well as by Julie Hollister and Stephanie Noble from the YMCA to discuss another workforce-related topic, childcare, in the wake of COVID-19. So thank you and have a great day.